When I was 9 years old, I came home from school one day to find my mom and my grandpa sitting at the kitchen table. They'd been waiting to give me some bad news, and that bad news was that my dad was missing. He and my Uncle Lee had gone off on a weekend hunting trip and were about half a mile into the woods east of Coretta when Dad realized that he'd left his grunter in his truck. And a grunter is basically just sort of a duck whistle, but it sounds like a buck's grunt, and after telling Uncle Lee to wait where he was, Dad walked back to his truck, never to be seen again. Uncle Lee said that he waited about 20 to 30 minutes before he started to get worried, and then he made his way back to the truck. But my dad was nowhere to be found, and by nightfall, Uncle Lee had every deputy from the McDowell County Sheriff's up in those hills trying to find my dad, and the search effort lasted about 2 weeks, but after failing to find a single trace of him, the county sheriff called it off. Mom kept his name on the missing persons register for a long time, while the whole family and all of his friends pitched in to hire a private investigator. The guy was a retired police officer from Charleston, a good one too, but in the end, there was only one thing that he could tell my mom and grandpa that they hadn't already heard from the county sheriff. The most likely explanation was that, for some reason, Dad had walked through the woods until he came to a series of old mining pits near a town called Cucumber. And then, as their theory goes, Dad walked into one of those mines, fell down a shaft, and his body had been laying in the bottom ever since. Yet during that initial search and rescue attempt, every mine shaft that could be safely explored had been mapped out by a team of caving specialists, and the tunnels that weren't safe had teams of cadaver dog handlers dispatched to them. Dad's body wasn't found in any of them, though. That didn't mean that it wasn't there. The sheriff couldn't rule that out entirely, but there was something that he neglected to mention that Mom later found from the PI that she hired. There was graffiti in one of the mine shafts. The private investigator said he didn't recognize any of the symbols or words, but they'd been crudely daubed in a sort of spray paint about midway through one of the tunnels, so he could only assume that the place was a hangout for local teens. And that's what led him to believe that the kids who'd tagged those tunnels might also know what happened to my dad. And despite his best efforts, he couldn't locate any of them. Uncle Lee tried to help as best he could and kept in close contact with the private investigator, but he took Dad's disappearance harder than anyone. Everyone kept telling him that it wasn't his fault, that there was no way that he could have known, and that he did all the right things. But he was never quite the same after Dad disappeared, and no one could blame him. I didn't get the full story of what had happened until I was much older, but between the day he went missing and the day Mom had him declared legally deceased, there was a lot of hope and a lot of heartbreak. Having my sister and I asking when is Daddy coming home almost drove Mom crazy with grief. But as we got older and we accepted that he was never coming back, it got more and more easy to deal with until it just kind of faded into the background. Dad's disappearance was behind us, but it was still there. It was always there, really. By the time I was 22, my sister had moved over to Morgantown for college, and I was working full-time at a fixin' shop in Welsh, and I hadn't seen Uncle Lee in maybe 4 or 5 years by that point. He sent us birthday and holiday messages and would occasionally call Mom around the anniversary of Dad's disappearance. But other than that, he kept himself very distant. At least until the day when Mom said that he'd called and had asked to talk to me. I was more than happy to see him for the first time in years, and I understood why Uncle Lee had kept his distance. He once told my mom that I reminded him of a younger version of my dad, and while some of those memories brought him a lot of joy, they brought him a lot of pain, too. And because of that, I thought I wouldn't see much of Uncle Lee anymore, and that brought me quite a bit of pain as well. And so you can imagine how happy I was when I'd heard that he wanted to meet up. I drove over to his place out near Filbert one Saturday around midday, and what followed was what I can only describe as a 2-person family reunion. We were both happy to see each other, and after spending all morning worrying that he'd be some depressive alcoholic, it was a huge relief to see him very clear-eyed and on his feet. As we caught up, we shared some cold cuts and chow, along with a cold beer, and the conversation sort of meandered around the subject of my dad until there was no avoiding him anymore. We talked about this and that, things he used to do and how much we missed him, and then out of nowhere, Uncle Lee had a proposal for me. He asked if I wanted to visit the site of my dad's disappearance, suggesting that it might provide a degree of closure. He said that he'd been up in those hills east of Coretta about half a dozen times, and even though he'd never found so much as a trace of my dad, it helped alleviate the feeling of uselessness that had plagued him ever since. And at first, it didn't sound like such a hot idea. I could appreciate why walking those hills helped Uncle Lee deal with the pain and loss, but to me, meandering around the area my dad vanished from sounded like slow torture. I was just happy to be in touch with my uncle again, someone I could actually build a relationship with, because after my grandpa died, he was the only paternal figure I had left. Focusing on my dad like that, in a negative way I mean, I couldn't see the benefit. Yet slowly but surely, over the course of about a year or so, I came around to the idea that this might provide some much-needed closure. I'd been visiting Uncle Lee every couple of weeks between the time we first got in touch and the day that I suggested that we drive up into the hills east of Coretta, and then hike out to the place that he last saw my dad. He was happy to hear that I'd changed my mind, but it was very muted, for lack of a better word. Kind of like he didn't want to show the emotion of how much it meant to him, because he was worried that it'd scare me off. He didn't ask what had changed my mind, but if he did, I'd have told him that it came down to something as simple as this. If I started feeling too emotional, negatively emotional I mean, we could always just turn around, walk back to my truck, and drive home. Nothing was keeping me there, and if walking those woods didn't provide any good feeling, at least I'd be able to say that I tried. Uncle Lee and I arranged to drive down to Coretta together on a Saturday morning in early May. To my relief, we'd somewhat shifted the focus away from my dad's disappearance and began treating it like a regular old hike through the woods. We'd uphold our long-standing tradition and take along a few beers and some cold cuts, and then if at any point I felt like talking about him or asking questions about my father, then we could cross that bridge once we came to it. I'll admit to feeling a little anxious as we drove alongside the creek and got closer to the back road we were good to park my truck on. But by the time we got to walking and talking, I realized that patch of woods was no different than any other in West Virginia. I'd always considered that area around Coretta to be haunted. Not literally, of course, but it might as well have been like the ghost of my dad was wandering those hills. I never wanted to go there as long as I lived, so to suddenly be there one day and realizing it was mostly all in my head, it was definitely good for me. But the word mostly is kind of carrying a lot of the weight in that sentence. And as much as it felt regular as anything to be walking through those woods with my Uncle Lee, it was like there was still a piece of my dad out there, hiding away someplace. Call it a memory, call it hope, but there was something, and I could feel it. And we kept on walking and talking till we got to Big Creek, and then, after making ourselves comfortable on a flat rock at the edge of the creek, we had ourselves a little break. And I figured that marked the halfway point of our hike, so when we were done, I suggested that we head back towards my truck. But Uncle Lee had another idea. He said that there was something he wanted to show me, and then after another mile or so of walking, we came to a rocky outcropping which overlooked the abandoned mines that I told you about earlier. I asked him if that was the place the private investigator had checked out all those years before, and Uncle Lee said it was. And then after a sigh, he said that there was something he'd never told me and my mom. He told the sheriff all right, and he told the PI too. He just never had the heart to tell me or Mom that the last time he'd seen my dad had been when he was walking in to one of those mine shafts. So between noticing my dad was missing and informing the authorities, Uncle Lee said that he'd run all over the woods calling out Dad's name and trying to find him before the situation got serious. Uncle Lee said that he was never much of a tracker. He simply got lucky in heading in the right direction. He didn't think my dad had walked in the direction of those mines, but when he stood in that exact same spot that we were stood in, he saw a distant figure dressed exactly like my dad walking into one of the dark, derelict tunnels. Uncle Lee said that he scrambled down the steep incline of the outcrop and then ran off in the direction of the mine shaft that he'd seen my dad walk into. But when he got there and walked inside with his flashlight in hand, there was no one there. When I asked Uncle Lee if he'd seen the same weird graffiti as the PI did, he said no, but that there was something about that old mine shaft that made him feel very uneasy. According to Uncle Lee, that's what had truly been haunting him for all these years. The idea that he'd seen his brother walk into a dark tunnel, then upon hearing his name being called had chosen to hide in the dark, pretending not to hear. And to him, that was the best case scenario. The worst case was that something had happened to him in that old mine, something terrible that meant that he couldn't walk or talk anymore, even if he wanted to. I understood why such information had been withheld from me, The situation was bad enough, without piling more unsettling mystery on top of it, but still, I told Uncle Lee that I was glad that he'd shared the whole truth with me, even if it was as disturbing as it was painful. And I figured after that it was time to leave, but Uncle Lee had another proposal for me, and one that I found impossible to turn down. He asked if I wanted to walk down to the mine with him, as it was something he himself did every so often as part of his attempt to exercise that area of the hills. And by that point, I couldn't think of a reason why we shouldn't. We'd already walked all that way, and I had no idea if or when I'd return. And so not heading down to that mine seemed like it'd be a wasted opportunity, and if it worked for Lee in dispelling some of the heartache, then it might just work for me too. And so I agreed, and off we went. Heading down the steep face of the outcrop was definitely not a smart move, so we walked around the edge of the mining pit a little bit to find a safer way down. At the bottom, all kinds of warning signs had been hammered into the dirt telling people to keep out, and that they'd be seriously injured if they tried exploring any of the old tunnels. I asked Uncle Lee if he thought that my dad had fallen down a mine shaft or had been the victim of a freak cave-in that had left him unable to respond to his cries. He didn't know for certain, but if that was the case, Dad's body would have been found a long time ago. Whatever happened to him, it happened in that old mine. It just hadn't been properly explained yet. As we got closer and closer to the mine's entrance, which appeared as a jagged scar in the rock, it was like the air itself grew heavier. Very little light was making its way down the tunnel, but I remember seeing splintered wooden beams jutting out at odd angles like broken teeth in the mouth of some great serpent. Neither myself nor Uncle Lee said a word as we approached the entrance, and the place was so quiet that the sound of our boots crunching into the gravel and slate seemed unnaturally loud. I started to see things like discarded tools, a cracked lantern, a coil of frayed rope half buried in the dirt. Things which suggested the mine had been abandoned in a hurry rather than in an organized or phased fashion. I asked Uncle Lee if he knew why the place had been abandoned in the first place, and he said that he'd heard rumors of flooding, but didn't know for certain if they were true or not. The official explanation was that the company had simply gone out of business. But if that was true, why did the place look like it had been abandoned so hastily? And as we got within just a few feet of the mine's entrance, it was like the temperature dropped by a few degrees, and the darkness in front of me seemed to swallow up all the outside light after just a few feet. I figured Uncle Lee could sense my apprehension, because he started telling me how I didn't have to go inside if I didn't want to. All I had to do was say the word and we could just leave. But like I said, there was no way I was going to just turn around and go home, not after we'd walked all that way. And so, slowly but surely, I started walking toward the entrance and the rusted cage bars of the open gate beyond. I can recall the oddest things from the first few moments. I remember how it got even colder as I stepped into the shaft, and how the air had both a smell and taste to it too. Just dust, metal, and mold all rolled into one. The light from outside disappeared quickly, but luckily, I had a tiny flashlight that I kept attached to my keyring, and so after sort of fumbling with it to free it from the ring, I held down the small button and suddenly I could see again. I say I could see again, but not by much. The light from the little keyring attachment was only enough to keep a few feet of darkness at bay, so my pace stayed slow as I tread deeper into the tunnel. I took a few steps and then stopped, then after taking a few more, I turned around to check if Uncle Lee was following me. But when I did, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Uncle Lee was standing near the cage gate, almost like a total silhouette by then, but there was just enough light for me to see that he held something in his hand. It was something that I knew that he had with him, but something he had no reason to produce in that moment. It was a gun, and the hand that he held it in was shaking. In the microseconds that followed me spotting the gun in his hand, part of me screamed out to reason with him, and there was a brief glimmer of hope when the thought occurred to me that he'd produced that pistol for our own safety. But the way it trembled in his hand, the way he didn't say a single goddamn thing as I turned back to look at him, I got this feeling, sharp as a blade, that I wasn't safe at all. And so I ran. I ran down that tunnel with my tiny crappy flashlight as the first of Lee's gunshots rang out. The crack split the air behind me, and the bang felt like it exploded my eardrums as I felt the bullet fly past me, all in the same moment, and my adrenaline surged as I realized, to not make myself an easy target, I had to turn my flashlight off. Then as I eased my thumb off that button, I was just plunged into darkness. I'd never been so scared in my entire life. I didn't know it was even possible to feel that level of terror. The only light came from Uncle Lee's shots as my lungs burned and my muscles began to scream, and any second I expected to either take a bullet or slam into a complete wall. As it turned out, I was headed for a wall, and the only thing that alerted me was seeing one of Lee's bullets ricochet off something metallic. I flicked on my flashlight for a second and saw the tunnel diverting into 3 different directions, and I picked a path in a split second and then kept running. And only then I was out of Lee's sight that I could switch that little flashlight back on and start looking for a place to hide. As I ran into the diverting tunnel, the weak glow of the flashlight in my hand started to bounce off the much narrower walls, and I suddenly realized something had been written on them. At first I thought it was the graffiti the private investigator had mentioned, but even while running at full speed, I saw it was unlike any variety I'd ever seen before. It looked like writing of some kind, smeared in black paint, and an entire section of the tunnel appeared covered in what had to be more than 1,000 lines of it. I didn't even recognize the language, but for reasons you're already aware of, I also didn't have time to stop and study it. What I was really looking for was a place to hide, and I soon found one. Soon after I started to see all that weird script on the walls, I started to see a bunch of smaller and larger chambers leading off from the tunnel that I was running down. I picked one at random, lunged into it, and then tucked into the nearest corner to conceal myself from Lee's flashlight in case he pointed it into the chamber. I kept my breathing shallow, but my heart was hammering against my ribcage, and I quickly realized my hiding place did nothing to dampen my terror. Sure, I was out of Lee's sight, at least temporarily, but more than anything, I realized I was trapped. I remembered how I tried to stay as quiet as possible, but for the first few minutes, which felt like hours, my ears rang non-stop from the tunnel having amplified that sound of Lee's shots. I wondered if my hearing would ever go back to normal, and imagined Lee being able to creep right up on me without me ever being able to hear him. It was almost a relief when I started to hear his voice, along with the sound of crunching gravel as his footsteps got closer and closer. I wasn't deaf, but I was still trapped, so what little relief I felt was quickly drowned out by the raw terror of knowing that I was being hunted. Lee started calling out my name, telling me to come out, not trying to reason with me or make excuses for shooting at me, just telling me that I needed to come out because sooner or later, he was going to find me. I couldn't move. The sound of my footsteps would have almost certainly alerted him to my location, so I had no other choice but to remain in place and stay quiet as possible. That part was surprisingly easy because running all that way, with how unfit I was at the time, meant that I was more than happy to stay still and just catch my breath. When his footsteps got louder still, he suddenly pointed his flashlight down the tunnel my hiding place was at. Staying still and quiet suddenly got a lot harder in that moment. I remember saying it over and over in my head, with my voice being clear as a bell in my mind saying, "Don't come down here. Don't come down here. Please, God, don't let him find me." And I guess God listened, because instead of heading down the tunnel that I was in, he just kept on walking. I thought that might be my chance to make a run for it. If Lee was heading deeper into the mine, then maybe I could slip out behind him. But that glimmer of hope was quickly snuffed out when I remembered how loud my own footsteps would be, and how he might not miss all of his shots that time. And he technically had not missed all of his shots. I later found a bullet hole running through one of the flap pockets of my jacket. But like I was saying, I stayed dead still in that dark chamber, keeping my ears tuned for Lee's voice and footsteps. They were still ringing from the shots, and I could hear my heart pulsating into my ears, but it wasn't as bad as it had been previously, and I could hear almost every word Lee was saying as he continued to hunt me down. His footsteps were slow and steady, and occasionally he mumbled something I couldn't quite make out. But then suddenly, his footsteps went from slow and rhythmic to sharp and quick with a scrape of gravel, and then there was silence. It sounded like he suddenly turned around, like he'd heard something that had startled him, and he figured it was me trying to make a break for it. He stayed still for a few moments, a horrible silence hanging in the air, and then he said, "I know you're here, Stanley." And hearing those words terrified me in ways I never thought possible, because Stanley isn't my name. It was my dad's name. It was like my mind was on the verge of fracturing from the combination of terror, confusion, and painful memory. Uncle Lee must have lost his goddamned mind. There was no other explanation for it, and the reality of what that meant for me was almost too much to handle. I wanted more than anything to try and reason with him, to appeal to a sense of kinship. We'd already lost one man in the family. There was no reason to lose another, especially not by his own hand. But I also knew that there was a chance that that gamble would be the last I'd ever take. He'd already tried to kill me, and there was nothing to say that he wouldn't try again. In the end, I resigned myself to just staying put, and simply waiting until he came around the corner of my hiding place. I'd rush him, and try to get control of that gun. Then whatever happened next, I could only hope for the best. But as I listened to his footsteps become slow and steady again, waiting for them to get louder and louder before I saw his flashlight, we both heard the sound of something else moving in those tunnels. I couldn't tell you who it was. They didn't say a word, and I didn't hear any additional footsteps. All I heard was what sounded like rocks shifting someplace deeper in the tunnels, and then Lee started to speak. I couldn't make out what he was saying at first. He just stopped dead still and then started to mutter something under his breath. I had absolutely zero clue what was going on. I was scared out of my mind, but all I could do was stand there, still as a goddamn statue, and keep my ears tuned like my life depended on it. Because it did. And Lee just carried on muttering to himself, or at least it sounded like he was muttering to himself. And then out of nowhere, I felt this rush of warm air blow through the tunnels, like it was coming from deep down someplace, and it smelled like evil. And when I say that it smelled like evil, I only use that word in place of death. I was about to write it smelled like death, but as someone unfortunate enough to have come across a rotting deer carcass in high summer, that's not the same scent as what I smelled in that mine shaft that day. It wasn't that sort of sick smell of rotten decay that makes you want to either puke or run or both. It was something so foul it shouldn't exist by any natural law. It smelled like burning death. That's the only way I can truly sum it up. Like something that can't exist here on the surface, something older than the mine itself. It had me covering my mouth and nose with my shirt because my first assumption was that it was one of those toxic gases I once read about miners having to worry about. And I remember thinking, so this is why they had to abandon this godforsaken place, as I kept my shirt clamped over my mouth and nose. And then suddenly, I hear Lee begin to yell something. I can't guarantee that these were his exact words, merely by recollection of them, but to my memory he said, "He's here. I brought him. I did what you asked." He repeated himself a lot, said stuff in between like please or you gotta believe me. But he said that first part over and over, in fits and rage, with his screams getting louder and louder until I couldn't make the words out anymore. By the time his yells had degenerated into what sounded like screams of pain and terror, I made a run for it, in the hopes that he was suitably distracted. He wasn't anywhere near the tunnel I was in. I didn't even see his flashlight as I ran, but during the whole time that I was hurtling out of that tunnel at speeds I was sure would end in me falling, I heard Lee's screams. I kept on hearing them as I ran out into the daylight, too. They were much fainter and had this eerie, echoey quality about them, but I could still hear them right up until they suddenly went silent. And I didn't look back, though. I didn't even consider it. I just kept on running towards the gentler slope we'd used to climb down into that pit. I then scaled it and then carried on running through the woods until my legs screamed out no more. The woods were quiet, but Uncle Lee's screams kept on echoing around in my head, and I was overtaken by these contradictory feelings of trauma and this bizarre sense of victory. I'd made it out, but I couldn't enjoy that feeling because, for whatever reason, Uncle Lee hadn't. When I couldn't run anymore, I began walking back to my truck, and it took a long time before I spotted the glint of its metal bed through a thinning thicket of trees. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, and then after yanking it open, I slid into the driver's seat and just sort of sat there for a moment, staring at the windshield. I couldn't even process what had just happened to me, and I think I've already said this, I couldn't feel happy that I made it either. Instead, it was just this numb sense of resignation that I had to drive home and report my own attempted murder to the county sheriff, along with a single word: why? I could only manage to drive my truck as far as Coretta before I had to stop. There was no way that I'd be able to drive safely given my condition, and it was the first place available to call the sheriff's department. My hands were still shaking when I asked a motel receptionist if I could use their phone. I could tell that she was a little scared of me on account of my appearance and demeanor, but she let me use their phone all the same. I didn't bother trying to keep the call private. I lowered my voice, but with a girl right there in front of me, there wasn't much that I could do to keep her from hearing. I told the dispatch lady that my uncle had tried to kill me at the abandoned mining pit north of Cucumber, and how I thought that he'd had some kind of accident and was still inside. And I must have sounded real wigged out and distant, but they understood enough to send help. 2 deputies showed up to the motel in a cruiser maybe 10 to 15 minutes later, and I told them everything. They wrote it all down, then they told me that they'd call me once they'd checked out the mines. I drove home, took a shower, and tried to process everything that had happened, but there was no processing it, and even after all these years, I still haven't been able to. A few hours later, I got a call from one of the deputies. They found footprints and shell casings, but no Uncle Lee. And what followed was the exact same process as what happened after my dad went missing. At least, I imagine it all went down in a similar way. The sheriff got search and rescue involved, who once again explored the mine as deep as it was safe to do so, and there was no sign of Uncle Lee anywhere. No blood, no body, no weapon. Only those shell casings lying near the entrance from where he'd shot at me and I'd run. I told them all about the rush of warm air and how Lee had started to scream, "He's here, I brought him, I did what you asked." And then after many weeks of investigating and consulting with experts, the county sheriff announced their conclusion, and this is what he told us. In mining, there are things called blowouts or gas blowouts. These events involve accidental releases of gases like methane, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, or carbon dioxide, all of which can build up in the mines and prove toxic at certain concentrations. They're caused by things like drilling, blasting, and sudden changes in pressure, and cause poison gases to rush out like tsunamis of toxic vapor. And it's one of those blowouts that the sheriff believed me and my uncle had been caught up in. They explained that in all likelihood, Uncle Lee was hit with a kind of gas cocktail, consisting for the most part of highly concentrated CO2, and this led to a kind of frightened disorientation, which ended up causing him to attack me in his confusion. Naturally, given the circumstances, the sheriff told me and Mom that Lee had become the #1 suspect in my dad's disappearance, in which there had almost certainly been some kind of foul play involved. There had been no activity in his bank account after he disappeared, which was probably the #1 reason we all thought that he was gone and hadn't just decided to vanish without a trace. It was still possible that Dad going missing had nothing to do with what Lee did later, but the sheriff himself said that he was very interested in catching up with Lee so he could find out why he'd called me by my dad's name instead of my own. But more than 2 decades have passed now, and not a trace of Uncle Lee or my dad has ever been found. After the sheriff and his search and rescue people searched the mine, he ordered them all to seal it off with explosives to prevent others suffering the same tragic fate. But their opinion of what Lee's fate was and my own opinion differ greatly. I didn't make a fuss at the time, and I still don't. And what I'm writing now is the first word of objection I've ever committed to paper, let alone voiced out loud. But I don't believe for a second that it was some rush of CO2 that made Uncle Lee start shooting at me. I told the sheriff back then over and over that the rush of warm air didn't happen as we were walking in. It happened as I was hiding, right before Lee started calling out for my dad, saying all that weird stuff and eventually screaming unintelligibly. But the sheriff and his experts acted like I got it all wrong, that I was so disoriented by the fear, the adrenaline, probably a dose of CO2 myself, that I didn't really know what had happened to me. But I do know what happened to me, and I know what happened to my Uncle Lee too. I just don't think I'm ready to actually say it. I also don't think that I'll ever be ready to really say it, because doing so feels like opening the door to some great and terrible darkness. I just know that there's something out there, deep in those mine shafts just north of Cucumber, that's better off left alone. My name is Mira, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UNC Chapel Hill's Department of Anthropology. My research focuses on the intersection of cultural practices and social identity, with an emphasis on ethnographic methodologies and historical contextualization. Or, in plain English, I study how people's traditions and sense of belonging connect by watching them closely and looking at their past. I've undertaken a lot of interesting projects in my time, and while most have been both enriching and satisfying, there's one that I frankly wish that I could forget. And that's not down to the subject matter nor the people that I dealt with, as I cannot speak too highly of either, but rather a very particular encounter with a very particular woman while researching the kinship networks, ritual traditions, and sociocultural resilience of the Melungeon Appalachians. To cut a very, very long story short, the Melungeons are a mixed-race people who inhabit the area where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina intersect. They're believed to have a blend of European, African, and Native American ancestries with origins tracing back to the late 18th century or earlier. The term Melungeon comes from the French word mélange, meaning mixture, and was applied to those who lived in relative isolation in areas like Hawkins and Hancock counties in Tennessee, Lee County in Virginia, and parts of western North Carolina. The exact origins of the Melungeons remains hotly debated, with theories ranging from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors or lost colony survivors to unions between free peoples of color, European settlers, and indigenous groups like the Cherokee or Saponi Native Americans. Genetic studies, such as those from the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, suggest many Melungeons have roots in sub-Saharan Africa and northern Europe, possibly from early colonial interactions before strict racial laws had been established. Physical traits like dark hair, light eyes, and the so-called Melungeon bump on the head have been observed by researchers, though appearances are known to vary widely. Over time, many Melungeons have assimilated into broader populations, but these days, it's common for their descendants to embrace their ancestry through groups like the Melungeon Heritage Association, who celebrate a complex identity that challenges what has traditionally been rigid racial categories. Undertaking research into the Melungeons seemed like an incredible opportunity, and in anthropology it's rare to get one like that doesn't come with a 14-hour flight and a phrase book. And I was overjoyed to receive the news my proposal had been accepted. But if I'd have known what I was going to encounter, there's no way in hell that I'd ever have honored it. And this is why. I remember driving along this winding Appalachian road, my old sedan rattling over the gravel as I wondered if the old girl was finally going to give up before I made it to my destination. The latest thread that I'd pulled led me to a village called Hollow Ridge, a place that, depending on which one you studied, wasn't even on the map. Some accounts made the rather incredible claim that the town's population manifested an atypical aging process, one that ostensibly deviated from normative physiological expectations. Or to phrase it like the nice lady at the diner I stopped at said, all that good mountain air means folks out there live a heck of a long time. My notebooks were full of dead ends, so I figured that there was no harm in chasing that one too. After hours of driving, Hollow Ridge finally came into view. Clapboard houses sagged against the hillside, smoke curled from chimneys, while a few folks lingered on porches watching me roll in. I parked near a general store, grabbed my bag, and stepped out to breathe the air that smelled of damp earth and pine oil. A man in overalls nodded me from across the street, and I quietly nodded back, then headed inside the store. The store clerk, a wiry guy with graying hair, eyed me up with suspicion when I started asking questions about the village. I told him I was a genealogist, tracking Melungeon bloodlines, and he frowned, giving me another look of mistrust and then pointed me toward a direct path leading up the ridge. "Folks up there don't take to outsiders," he said, and then told me, "You better mind yourself." I thanked him, bought a Coke and a pack of gum, and then started walking toward the ridge. The path climbed up steep and cut through thick woods as my boots crunched on leaves and twigs, and it was tough going, but after maybe a mile or so I came to a cluster of houses, smaller and older than the ones below. A woman sat on a porch shelling peas. She looked up, and her eyes were dark and steady as I introduced myself, and I said that I was researching family histories. She didn't smile. She just jerked her head toward the house behind her. "Mama's inside," she told me. "She the one you want to talk to." I stepped up onto the porch, and the door creaked open before I could knock. Two men stood there, both tall with weathered skin and white hair, who looked as if though they might be brothers. They didn't invite me in, and they didn't ask me what I wanted either. They just stared until I took the initiative and explained why I was there. I kept it simple, and then the slightly shorter man who had a scar across his cheek told me, "Mama's 112. She don't talk much. Don't tire her out." The other one nodded, and then they stepped out of the doorway and beckoned me inside. The house smelled of mildew and wood smoke, with a dim living room lit by a single electric lamp. In the corner, lying in a single bed, was a woman, or at least what was left of one. When I say that she was skeletal, I mean that in the very sense of the word. Her skin was stretched so tight over her bones that it looked like the slightest touch would draw blood, and while her eyes were sunk so far deep in their sockets that it made her look nothing short of ghostly. Her hair hung in these thin white strands, and her hands rested like claws by her sides, and her breathing sounded like her windpipe was lined with sandpaper. I'd seen elderly folks before, but she was something else, and as I sat down on the stool one of her sons dragged over for me, she exhibited no reaction to me whatsoever. Not a look, not a word, nothing. I started easy by asking her name. When she didn't respond, one of her sons whispered, "Oneida," from behind me. I then asked where her people came from, and she offered no answer, and her gaze remained locked on the near distance, unblinking. I tried asking about her parents, her childhood, but still got nothing, and her sons hovered nearby, their arms crossed as they watched. "She's weak," one of them eventually said. "Don't push her now." I told them that I understood, but my curiosity burned in my chest, and a 112-year-old who looked like she'd been starving for decades, I had to know more. I leaned forward, keeping my voice soft as I asked her, "Ma'am, how long have you lived for? And how have you lived so long? What's your secret?" For the first time, she seemed to latch onto a word, and after her eyes widened and her lips parted, she turned to me with a look of fear on her face. And then, in a faint, raspy voice that was barely above a whisper, she said, "It eats the years." And the strain of forcing out the words looked like it was killing her, and when she was done, her eyes rolled back and her body jerked weakly as she began to gasp for air. Her sons rushed over, one yelling for me to get out while the other tended to his mother. I grabbed my bag and stumbled outside, heart hammering as the door slammed behind me. And then as I walked back down to the ridgeline, the old woman's words echoed around my skull. What in the world did she mean by, "It eats the years"? I wanted to go back. I wanted that more than anything to just demand answers. But I knew better than to outstay my welcome in such an isolated place. The woman with the peas was gone, her bowl abandoned as I started down the path with the son's cry of "Don't come back" still ringing in my ears. When I got back to my car, I sat for a while, scribbling down every detail I could. The village felt different now, quieter and heavier, and as I drove off, I found myself checking my rearview mirror much more frequently than usual. That night, I sat in my apartment replaying the day's events over and over in my head. Oneida's face wouldn't leave me, and neither would her words. And I tried to sleep, but the whole encounter just kept replaying in my mind. Then, when I finally did get some sleep, I had the most vivid nightmare where it was me who was lying in that bed, more than a century old, crunching the words, "It eats the years," in the face of some terrified young researcher. And the next morning, I called a research fellow that I happened to be friends with, a folklorist who'd written whole studies on Appalachian myths and legends. I told him about Hollow Ridge, about Oneida and what she'd said to me. And he went quiet for a few seconds, then, after audibly clearing his throat, said that he'd heard a lot of rumors of a village fitting that description. He'd never been able to confirm them because they never came with many details, just old folk tales about pacts with the land. He told me such a find might end up being a great source of pride for me and that he was excited to read my paper when it was finished. I thanked him, but after I hung up, I found myself even more unsettled than before. As the days went by, I found it impossible to think of anything else. Maybe it was the way my friend had hyped me up, but I simply had to know more. And so about a week later, I drove back to that village, parked my car, and then walked down that path again. But when I arrived at the village and walked up the ridgeline to where Oneida's home had been, no one was on the porches and the houses seemed empty. I reached Oneida's family home and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. However, upon finding that door was unlocked, my curiosity got the better of me and I pushed it open. The living room was empty. No lamp, no bed, no Oneida. I checked the other rooms. Nothing. No furniture or signs of life. I walked back outside and called out, but I got nothing but silence. And it was like everyone vanished. And weeks went by. I found myself avoiding my research, but the question still gnawed at me. What had Oneida meant by "it eats the years"? It obviously couldn't be literal, right? It had to be a metaphor, but for what? And why did it look like it scared her so badly? I began digging into my books, cross-referencing Melungeon folklore with anything I could find on Hollow Ridge, but I had no luck. I then engaged with the university's archival resources, including those in the North Carolina collection at Wilson's Special Collections Library, and it was there that I had a small but very significant breakthrough. One night, while elbow-deep in online research, I found an old journal scan dated from the 1700s that detailed a fur trapper's account of what he called Hungry Hollow. The village he described matched Hollow Ridge to a T, and while he didn't provide much detail beyond the description, he stated very clearly that the place's unnatural temperament meant that he'd avoid a return visit no matter the cost. If you'd assumed my encounter with Oneida and her 2 sons failed to make it into my research paper, you'd be correct. I wanted more than anything to get to the bottom of what I'd seen and heard, but with nothing to reference outside of my own personal experience, doing so would have been fruitless at best and detrimental at worst. So instead of falling down a rabbit hole of a rather spurious nature, I decided that the best course of action was to simply try and forget about it. But I can't forget. And no matter how hard I try and rationalize what Oneida said to me, there's still something deeply unsettling about the way she acted while saying it. I wouldn't say that I've spent a lot of time around the elderly or the senile, not as much as other researchers, but I feel capable of distinguishing the confusion and fright of slowly losing one's mind from the very tangible terror associated with things people believe are real. But on that day, and in Oneida's eyes, I saw real emotion and real fear, and I'm in no hurry whatsoever to encounter it again in the near or distant future. Among the shadowy hollers of 19th century rural Tennessee, a series of terrifying occurrences would come to etch themselves into American folklore as some of the most sinister ever recorded. It was a force of malevolence so palpable, so relentless, that it claimed a life, drove a family to the brink of madness, and left a legacy of fear that lingers in the air of Robertson County to this day. But the force in question was no mere ghost story whispered around campfires. She was a woman who actually existed, and over time her deeds and devilry would earn her the nickname, the Bell Witch. This is not a tale of vague apparitions or spurious sightings. This is the true account of a presence so vile it defied explanation, and a nightmare that clawed its way into reality and refused to let go. The Bell family, consisting of John Sr., his wife Lucy, and their 9 children, had settled into their sprawling farmstead in 1804, and have since carved out a life of relative comfort amid the untamed beauty of the Tennessee frontier. For more than a decade, their days were marked by the rhythm of toil and harvest, the creak of wagon wheels and the laughter of their many children. But in the summer of 1817, everything changed. It began with a knock on the cabin walls, sharp and insistent, like knuckles rapping on the other side of the grave. The family dismissed it, claiming the sound was the result of wind on a loose branch or perhaps a restless animal. But then came the scratches, clawing at the windows as if something begged to be allowed inside. Night after night, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, until the Bells could no longer deny them. John Bell Sr., a hardy, no-nonsense farmer with a dour demeanor, was the first to glimpse their vile visitor in the flesh. While walking through his cornfield one sweltering afternoon, he suddenly froze as a grotesque creature seemingly materialized before his eyes. He saw a dog-like beast with the head of a rabbit, its eyes glinting with a fiendish and unnatural hunger. In an instant, he shouldered and fired his musket, but as the shot echoed across the field, the canine creature vanished into thin air, leaving only the stench of sulfur and a creeping dread in its wake. That night, the knocking returned, fiercer and angrier than before, as if the beast had followed John Sr. home. The children began to see things too. Betsy, John's youngest daughter, wept as she described a girl in a green dress swinging from an oak tree, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. While Drury, one of his sons, swore a bird of monstrous size had flown down and perched itself atop the family barn, before staring at him with eyes that burned like fire and brimstone. And over time, the disturbances escalated with a ferocity that turned the Bell's family cabin into a crucible of terror. Furniture shook violently, while bed covers were ripped from sleeping bodies by invisible hands. Chains rattled across the floorboards, dragged by no discernible force, and the sightings of strange animals continued unabated. Then came the voices. They were mere whispers at first, hissing through the walls, followed by a raspy, guttural tone that seemed to claw its way up from the deepest circles of hell. "I am Kate," they declared. Suddenly, things started to make sense to old John Bell. Kate Batts had been the name of a deceased local woman rumored to have once cursed him over a land dispute. Yet whether it truly was her spirit or something far older masquerading in her name, no one could say. However, what was clear was that the spirit spoke with clarity that chilled the Bell family's blood, mocking them, revealing their deepest secrets, and taunting them with hints of horror yet to come. Little Betsy Bell, who was just 12 years old at the time, became Kate's favored target, as the witch poured her wrath upon her with a cruelty that defies comprehension. Invisible fists pummeled her fragile frame, leaving bruises and welts that bloomed like dark flowers across her skin. Her hair was yanked into knots so tight that it drew blood, with her screams swallowed by the night as the witch's ethereal voice cackled in delight. "You'll never know peace," it snarled, pinning her to the bed with a weight no human could lift. The family watched, helpless, as Betsy's bright spirit withered under the relentless assault. Her eyes grew hollow, and her voice was reduced to a mere whimper as the witch continued to deny her any rest. Neighbors flocked to the farm, drawn by tales of the disturbances, only to flee in terror as the witch turned its malice on them. It twisted up their insides, causing unimaginable pain, while hurling objects and shrieking curses that echoed through the trees. The witch might have targeted his children for particularly cruel torment, but it was the family's patriarch, John Sr., who bore the brunt of the witch's ultimate vendetta. She vowed to destroy him, and she pursued her goal with a sadistic and satanic zeal. His health unraveled as the haunting intensified. His tongue was swelled inexplicably, choking off his words. His face twitched with spasms that contorted into a mask of agony, while his limbs seized as if controlled by some cruel and malevolent mistress. The witch taunted him endlessly, her voice a venomous hiss in his ears. "I'll take your life, John Bell, and I'll dance on your grave." Eventually, on December 20th of 1820, after 3 years of relentless torment, John Sr.'s body finally failed him. He was found lifeless in his bed, having passed in his sleep with a vial of strange, foul-smelling liquid beside him. The family later confirmed it was poison, supposedly fed to him by the witch. The state of Tennessee recorded John's death as the only one officially attributed to a supernatural entity, a grim testament to the power of old Kate Batts, as well as the entity with which she'd compacted. Even Andrew Jackson, the fearless general and future president, proved unable to withstand the Bell Witch's fury. In 1819, he and his men camped on the Bell family's farm, eager to confront whatever entity inhabited the place. But as the wagon approached, its wheels locked inexplicably and the air filled with a deafening, hair-raising shriek. "I'd rather face the British Army than spend another night here," Jackson reportedly declared, fleeing before dawn with his troops in tow. If a man of his conviction was left quaking before the witch, what hope did a family of simple farmers have against it? The witch's reign of terror didn't end with John's death. It lingered, tormenting Betsy and the surviving Bells until 1821, when it abruptly announced its departure, but not without promising to return after 7 years. And true to its word, it reappears in 1828, shaking beds and whispering threats to Lucy and the remaining children before vanishing again. It vowed another return in 1935, 107 years later, and although no widespread haunting materialized, locals in Adams insist the entity never truly left. Strange lights flicker in the woods, disembodied screams pierce the silence of the night, and the Bell Witch Cave, a limestone hollow near the original farm, still undulates with an energy that drives visitors to the brink of sanity. Upon visiting the Bell Witch Cave, foolhardy visitors are greeted by what amounts to a gaping maw, its jagged walls glistening with slime and damp, while the air remains thick with a cloying and deeply unsettling stench. Those who brave its depths report footsteps echoing where no one walks, growls rumbling from the shadows, and a suffocating sense of being watched. In 1986, 2 reporters from the Tennessean planned to spend a night inside, armed with skepticism and flashlights. Yet staff writer David Gerard and staff photographer Bill Wilson lasted mere hours before bolting, driven out by guttural noises that swelled into a roar, a sound no cave should make. It was a short, powerful burst of sound that reverberated from the back of the cave and hit us like a slap, Gerard later wrote. It was not a metallic screech or the howl of wind. It was a vocal, loud, high-pitched scream, and we looked at each other, got through that gate, and quickly left the cave behind us. Of course, logically speaking, we frightened ourselves with our imaginations, Gerard continued. Or someone very much alive and human frightened us for fun and profit. Those are the reasonable explanations. But on the night in question, with my scalp tingling and my hair rising, our fear seemed reasonable, common sense. Gerard and Wilson seemed convinced that what they'd encountered was real. But was it actually the Bell Witch? And if so, what exactly is she? And many theories abound. Some call it Kate Batt's vengeful spirit, others a poltergeist fueled by Betsy Bell's adolescent turmoil. Yet some believe a demon, masquerading as some kind of spirit, is to blame. Science offers tepid explanations. Heavy metal poisoning might well account for John's symptoms, while mass hysteria seems to amplify and explain the rest. Yet such scientific theories fall flat against the hundreds of witnesses, from neighbors to clergy to President Jackson himself, who saw, heard, and felt the Bell Witch's wrathful presence. And surely no such hoax could sustain such terror for decades, nor would one be capable of leaving such a lasting scar on such a close-knit community. Today, the Bell family farm is long gone, but the Witch's Cave remains a pilgrimage site for thrill-seekers and paranormal investigators alike. Every creak of the trees, every unexplained shadow, carries the echo of old Kate Batt's mysterious malice. Locals speak of her in hushed tones, wary of invoking her name lest she turn her gaze their way. The Bell Witch is no campfire tale to be shrugged off at dawn. It's a wound in the fabric of reality, a reminder that some evils don't fade. They simply wait for its next victim. And in the stillness of the Tennessee night, when the wind dies and the darkness presses close, you might hear it. A faint knock, scratch, or whisper, which promises that the tale of the Bell Witch is far from over. Hey friends, thanks for listening, and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations.